The Secrets of Nerubar Palace is the second wing in the Nerubar's Palace raid. It is home to Rasha, Broodtwister, and the Nexus Princess. Very quickly going to describe how this guide is set up. The video is split into chapters for each boss. You can find them down below. The first chapter will describe the boss fight mechanics and each of the important abilities. The second chapter will be role-specific duties. LFR and Normal are practically identical, but I will make a note on differing areas. Rasha. This is a single phase fight with a brief intermission period where the raid must chase after the boss. This fight is very similar to the Dawnbreaker encounter, except you will not be using your mounts. Phase 1. The raid should stay positioned somewhat near the center of the boss, leaving the left and right sides clear to handle mechanics. The boss is going to target a few players with spinneret strands. These players need to move to the leftmost and rightmost side of the boss in order to drop these. Once it expires, any players that are inside of the ring will be tethered to the center of that web. That player must then run out of the web in order to break the tether. Each time a tether is broken, it deals raid-wide damage. The next ability is Rolling Acid. This will target two players with a large green line effect. The dark green line marks the start of the wave, and the gradient marks the direction the wave is going to travel. Players want to aim these on the outside of the raid, so the player with the left rolling wave needs to move to the left side, and the player with the right rolling wave needs to move to the right side, with all other raid members in the center. This rolling acid will remove the webbing that is on the ground and replace them with acid pools. One final mechanic is the Infested Swarm. Players that are targeted with this need to move close to the boss as a bunch of small ads will spawn. They will use Infested Bite, which applies a stacking debuff. This debuff ticks damage and reduces movement speed. The Tank Buster mechanic. Savage Assault. This deals big physical and nature damage. 60% of the damage that is unmitigated will be applied as a debuff that ticks damage every second for 12 seconds. This means use your defensive before this attack lands. This debuff can stack, and Savage Assault will be used twice in a row, so tanks should swap in between of those. Finally, Erosive Spray will deal unavoidable raid damage over 4 seconds applying a stacking dot. The intermission period occurs when the boss reaches 100 energy. It will fly up and begin relocating. The raid needs to pursue the boss while avoiding all of the swirlies. There are two kinds of swirlies. Gold swirlies will leave behind acid pools, and green swirlies will just deal damage at the impact zone. Once the boss reaches the next location, it will begin casting Acidic Eruption. This needs to be interrupted as it deals raid damage and grants the boss an immunity for 9 seconds. Each of these casts will also increase in strength. Phase 1 Abilities. Spinneret Strands. This generates a white ring around a few players. After a few seconds, it will detonate, creating a webbed area with a cocoon in the center. The target and any players inside that ring will be tethered to the cocoon and must run out of the webbing to break free. Each time a player breaks their tether, it will do a burst of raid-wide damage. Standing in the webbing will tick damage and slow you by 10%. Rolling Acid. This targets two players with the green line effect. Once this triggers, it sends a large acid wave that travels left or right. This deals damage and briefly stuns the player that was targeted, but any other players that are hit will have a 15-second poison dot applied to them. This wave will clear out any webbing on the floor and replace some of them with acid pools. To tell the direction of the wave, the dark green line shows the start and the gradient shows the direction that it travels. Left rolling waves are here, right rolling waves are here. Infested Swarm. This targets random players with green circles and arrows. Once cast, this will spawn a bunch of small ads. These small ads use Infested Bite. This is a stacking debuff that deals nature damage every second over 6 seconds. Erosive Spray. The boss pulses raid damage every second for 4 seconds. This also applies a stacking debuff that ticks damage over the next 12 seconds. Savage Assault. This is the Tank Buster. It deals physical and nature damage. 60% of the damage that is unmitigated is then applied as a Savage Wound debuff. Tacky Burst. If no player is within melee range, this deals raid damage and applies a stacking 9-second dot. The Intermission ability, Acidic Eruption. This is channeled. It deals massive raid damage every second and stacks with each pulse. Role-specific duties. Tanks. Use a defensive before Savage Assault. Swap after each hit. During the intermission, pursue and interrupt the boss from using Acidic Eruption. Healers. Expect constant raid damage this fight. Expect heavy raid damage during Erosive Spray. The tank's healing will change depending on how well they manage their cooldowns. Expect massive raid damage if Acidic Eruptions is not interrupted. DPS. Use a defensive for Erosive Spray. If targeted with Infested Swarm, move towards the tanks and AoE the ads down as they are the priority. Broodtwister. This fight has a single phase, but the raid must handle multiple ads while moving into different sections of the arena. The room is split into 3 areas, outlined here. In each corner of the room there is a container of black blood. When the boss is aggroed, he will move to the closest container and activate it. He will also activate another container once he reaches 100 energy. Once he activates a container, black blood will begin flooding out from that location and continue until the area is consumed. Inside of each area, there are 3 different types of eggs. Each egg spawns a specific type of ad. The goal here is to hatch all the eggs before the black blood reaches them. The raid will use the boss's ability in order to hatch these eggs. If the black blood reaches an egg, it will automatically hatch them and they will be empowered. This also applies to any already hatched ads, so keep them away from the blood or you'll probably wipe. The raid can start wherever they would prefer, however the section with the most small eggs should probably be cleared last as they pose the biggest threat. One final note, when the boss is activating a canister. During this period, every 5 seconds, the boss will send out swirlies that need to be avoided while also hitting the raid for damage and applying a healing absorb. Now let's cover the eggs. The biggest eggs spawn spiders. The tanks must grab these. They will use Vicious Bite, and with every use, it will increase the damage of the next bite by 25%. Medium eggs will spawn stationary worms. These cast an interruptible spell that, if not interrupted, will deal raid-wide poison damage. Small eggs spawn 5 little bugs that will target and pursue players. These need to be constantly CC'd and killed before they reach their target. If they reach their target, they apply a 10-second dot and spawn 2 more bugs. The last mechanic is Experimental Dosage. This will apply a purple circle around a couple players. After 6 seconds, any eggs that are inside this ring will hatch. The final tank-related mechanic is Volatile Concoction. This is an 8-second debuff that takes damage. Once the 8 seconds is up, it will deal a burst of damage to the entire raid. The damage that this does is dependent on how much health the tank has left. The closer to full health that the tank is, the less damage the raid will take. Broodtwister's Abilities. Ingest Black Blood. This is channeled when the boss opens a container. Every 5 seconds, the boss will deal raid-wide damage, apply a healing absorb to everyone, and send out multiple swirlies that need to be avoided. Unstable Infusion. This triggers once the boss finishes opening a container. This will send out multiple swirlies every 7.5 seconds and apply a small healing absorb to the raid. Experimental Dosage. This targets a couple players with a purple ring. After 10 seconds, it will explode, dealing damage, applying a healing absorb, and hatching any eggs that the ring touches. Volatile Concoction. This is the tank buster. This applies a heavy hitting dot that ticks every second for 8 seconds. Once it expires, it will deal a burst of raid damage. This damage is determined by the remaining health on the tank. The Colossal Egg hatches a colossal spider. This uses Vicious Bite, which deals nature damage, and this damage will increase by 25% with each use. Squirming Egg. These are the medium eggs. They hatch a voracious worm. This uses Poison Burst, which is an interruptible raid-wide damage spell. Quivering Brood Clusters. These are the small eggs. They hatch the blood parasites. They will fixate and pursue players. If they reach their target, they infest them, which applies a 10-second dot and spawns 2 more parasites. Sanguine Overflow. This is the blood that spills from the container. This deals damage and applies a healing absorb to any players that touch it. If it reaches an egg, it causes Caustic Reaction, which causes it to hatch and applies a 30-second dot that takes damage every 2 seconds. Empowered Ads. If the blood reaches the ads, they are empowered. Spider's Vicious Bite will now apply a stacking debuff that reduces healing done to the target by 6%. Worms have their HP increased by 25% and it increases their casting speed by 50%. Parasites have their HP increased by 25% and their movement speed increases by 10% every second that they are alive. Role-specific duties. Tanks. Use a defensive for Volatile Concoction and make sure your HP is close to full before it expires. Swap after each hit. Grab and tank any giant spiders. Beware of their damage stacking buff. Move the boss to the worm for cleave damage. Healers. The raid will take constant damage and have healing absorbs while the boss activates a container. The raid will have healing absorbs applied every 7.5 seconds throughout the fight. Expect a burst of raid damage when the debuff falls off the tank. This damage will scale depending on the tank's remaining HP. DPS. Hatch eggs closest to the blood. Ads are the top priority. Interrupt the worms every time. Crowd control and knockback on the small parasites. The Nexus Princess. This is a single phase fight with an intermission period. Phase 1. There is a hexagon shape around the boss, and this needs to be paid attention to as the raid must place debuffs at these corners to survive her rift attack. The boss should be tanked on one of these corners as well, only moving when the rifts are active. Assassination is the main mechanic here. She will target a few players with purple rings. Players with these rings need to move to one of the corners. Once it expires, a shadowy figure will remain in that position until the boss uses Nether Rift. This will spawn a rift on each shadow's location and where the boss is currently standing. These rifts will begin pulling players towards them, and any players that touch a rift will instantly die. Ideally, you want the rifts to be opposite each other as much as possible, as this will help negate the pull effects. If all of the rifts are on the same side, it will be much harder to escape the pool as it is quite strong. Once the rifts close, the boss uses Twilight Massacre. This will target one player with a line. Ideally, the boss and raid should be off-center so that the players targeted can aim this through the center of the hexagon, as the shadows will charge through and be repositioned on the opposite sides. If your line is blue, you are not targeted. If your line is red, that clone has you targeted. After the charge, the boss will activate the rifts again. The final mechanic here is daggers, which will just create a bunch of avoidable lines. At 100 energy, the boss will begin the intermission. Phase 1 abilities. Assassination. This marks several players with a purple ring. After 8 seconds, it deals damage and leaves behind a shadow clone. The amount of assassination targets increases after each intermission. Queen's Bane. This is applied to players that are hit with assassination. This deals damage every second for 9 seconds, and once it expires, it deals a burst of raid damage. Nether Rift. Opens rifts at the bosses and shadow clones locations. These strongly pull players towards them and will be fatal if touched. Twilight Massacre. Each shadow clone targets a player with a line. They will dash through those players. Blue means you are fine. Red means you are targeted. Daggers. Multiple lines appear on the arena. This deals damage to any player that is struck. Void Shredders. This is the tank buster. It inflicts physical and shadow damage and leaves behind a 35-second stackable debuff that increases damage by the next Void Shredders by 25%. Reaper. If any player drops below 10% HP, the boss will attempt to execute them. The Intermission. Once at 100 energy, the intermission begins. The boss moves to the center of the arena and begins channeling Starless Night for 24 seconds. This deals raid-wide damage every second. The main thing here is that some players will be targeted with Regicide, which is marked by a wide blue line. This is attached to each player, so if you move, it moves. Ideally, players that are targeted with this should just stand still and allow the other players to move around, as it can be quite hectic with those targeted, trying to avoid others that are also targeted. Aside from that, just survive the channel. If the boss reaches a third Starless Night, that will not end, basically meaning a wipe. Role-specific duties. Tanks. Taunt swap after each Void Shredders. Position the boss on one of the corners. Keep the boss out of the center for Twilight Massacre. Healers. Assassination targets will take a burst of damage and then more over the next 9 seconds. Expect a burst of raid damage 9 seconds after assassination. Expect constant raid-wide damage while rifts are active, and expect constant raid-wide damage during the intermission. DPS. Be mindful of where you are dropping the shadow clones. Use a defensive if you are targeted. Use cooldowns during the intermission and watch your lines. Congratulations, you just cleared the second wing of the Nerubar Palace raid. Shout out to these channel members. If this video helped them, press the thumbs up, subscribe if you enjoy WoW content. I have plenty of guides, tips and tricks, podcasts, and more. You can show extra support by becoming a channel member. It's 99 cents a month and gives you early ad-free access to all my videos. I'll see you in the next one.